Claude responded. I came home from a business trip to Denver on a Tuesday afternoon in March with a garment bag over my shoulder and the kind of tiredness that settles into your... I came home from a business trip to Denver on a Tuesday afternoon in March with a garment bag over my shoulder and the kind of tiredness that settles into your knees after 3 days of standing in convention centers talking to distributors about commercial refrigeration units. I had been making trips like this for 19 years. Regional operations manager for Ferris Cold Chain, the commercial refrigeration distribution company I had co-founded with a college friend in 2005 and taken full ownership of in 2016. Trips to Denver and Salt Lake City, and sometimes Phoenix. Never more than 3 days, always home by Tuesday evening. 19 years of the same rhythm. 3 days gone, Tuesday home, the house on Whitfield Court with the porch light on, and Nancy's minivan in the garage, and the smell of whatever she'd made drifting out to meet me at the door. I turned onto Whitfield. Nancy's van was in the driveway, not the garage. That was the first thing that felt wrong, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. The porch light was off. I pulled in behind the van and sat there for a second with the engine still running, the way you do when something in your body knows before your mind has caught up. It was 5:40 in the evening, and the light was already going gray at the edges, the way it does in early March, and the street had that particular quiet of a weeknight when everyone is inside, eating dinner, and nobody's paying attention to anyone else's house. I went in through the side door like always. The kitchen light was on, and the kitchen was the first room I saw, and the kitchen was where I understood, before I'd gone another step, that something had happened that I did not have a category for yet. The table was gone. Not moved gone. The chairs were gone. The rug that Nancy had picked out on a trip to Santa Fe 11 years ago, the one with the diamond pattern she said reminded her of her grandmother's house in Taos, was gone, and you could see the pale rectangle on the floor where the sun had never quite reached it. I walked into the living room, and the couch was gone, and the bookshelves were empty, and the framed photographs that had lined the hallway for 26 years of marriage, our wedding, the kids, as babies, the trip to the Grand Canyon in 2011, all of it was gone, and the nails were still in the wall, little empty punctuation marks where a life used to hang. I want to tell you that I called out her name. I didn't. Some part of me already understood there was nobody to answer. I walked through the dining room, through the hallway, into the bedroom, where the bed frame was still there because a bed frame takes tools and time, but the mattress was gone, and her side of the closet was empty, down to the bare rod, hangers still swinging slightly, like she'd only just left, and my side of the closet was untouched, my shirts still hanging in the same order I'd left them in 3 days ago. That detail told me something before I had words for what it told me. This wasn't rage. This wasn't a woman grabbing what she could reach on her way out the door. This was a woman who had taken exactly what was hers and left exactly what was mine, which meant somebody had made a list. Back in the kitchen, on the counter, next to the coffee maker that she hadn't taken because it had been a gift from her sister and maybe she couldn't bring herself to touch it, there was an envelope, cream-colored, my name written across the front in her handwriting. Walter. I stood there and looked at it for what felt like a long time before I picked it up. I need you to understand something about me before I go any further, because it matters for everything that comes after. I am not a man who reacts. I have spent 19 years building a distribution network across 4 states, and you cannot run a supply chain by feeling your way through it. You run it by reading what the data tells you and responding to what's actually there instead of what you wish were there. So I stood in my empty kitchen, holding an envelope with my name on it, and instead of falling apart, which is what I think most men would have done and what I might have done 20 years earlier, I made myself read the data. The van in the driveway with the keys still in it. Because she hadn't driven it away, someone had come for her, and she'd left the van because the van was titled in my name. The kitchen light left on, deliberately, so I wouldn't be standing in the dark when I found this. The furniture gone in a way that had clearly taken more than one trip, more than one day, and an envelope waiting for me, like she'd rehearsed this moment in her head for longer than I wanted to think about. I opened it. Inside was a letter, 3 pages, in her handwriting, on the stationery she'd used for thank you notes since before I met her. And behind the letter, folded into a single sheet, was a printed statement from a brokerage account. An account I recognized, the joint retirement account we'd built together since 2003, the one that held what I thought was going to be the two of us traveling in our 70s. The statement showed a withdrawal, $290,000, transferred 4 days earlier to an account at a bank in Sarasota, Florida, under a name I did not recognize. Gregory Halstead. I set both pages down on the bare counter. I stood in the kitchen of the house I had lived in for 22 years, surrounded by everything that used to be there, and I made myself think instead of feel, because thinking was the only tool I had that was still working. What the data told me was simple. My wife had not left in a fight. She had not left in the middle of an argument, in tears, in a moment either of us would later be able to explain as a mistake made in anger. She had left on a schedule. She had left after weeks, maybe months, of quiet preparation, at a time she had chosen, toward a destination she'd already arranged. And what she did not know, standing wherever she was standing right now in Florida, was that I had already been watching this coming for the better part of a year. My name is Walter Brennan. I'm 63 years old. I lived in Lansdale, Pennsylvania. And the woman who left an envelope on my kitchen counter on a Tuesday evening in March had made a calculation about me that was almost right. She thought she knew exactly what she was dealing with. What she hadn't accounted for was that I'd been doing the same math from the other side of the table for 11 months, and I was already finished before she'd even started. Hey, family, I appreciate you being here for this one. If this is your first time with me, hit that subscribe button and drop where you're watching from down in the comments, because I read every one of them. Let's get into it. I started Ferris Cold Chain with a man named Curtis Ferris in 2005. We'd met working commercial accounts for a national distributor and got tired of watching other people make money off decisions we were making for them. So, at 38 years old, we sat down at a diner in King of Prussia and decided we could do it ourselves. We started with one leased warehouse outside Norristown, 4 employees, and a relationship with a single manufacturer that we'd spent a year and a half convincing to take a chance on us. By 2012, we had 2 warehouses and 31 employees. In 2016, Curtis wanted out. His wife had gotten sick, and he needed to be closer to home, and I bought his half at a number that was fair to both of us, because that's what you do for a man who built something with you from nothing. By the time Nancy left, Ferris Cold Chain was pulling in just under $9 million a year across 3 states. I'm not telling you that to impress you. I'm telling you because the size of what I'd built is exactly what Nancy understood she'd married into back in 1998, and exactly what she'd apparently decided, at some point I still didn't fully understand, she was entitled to walk away with a piece of. Nancy Louise Whitcomb became Nancy Louise Brennan on a Saturday in October of 1998 at a church in Doylestown that her mother had picked out and that I mostly just showed up for. She was 34. I was 36. We'd known each other 2 years, which is long enough to think you know somebody, and short enough that you're still finding out things about them a decade in. She had this way of walking into a room and making people feel like they'd been the one she was waiting to see all night, a warmth that came easy to her and never came easy to me. I was better with inventory systems than I was with small talk, and for most of our marriage that had worked out fine, because she handled the parts of life that required charm, and I handled the parts that required getting things done, and between the two of us, we ran a pretty solid operation. We had 2 kids. Our daughter, Melissa, was 31, lived outside Philadelphia, worked in hospital administration, called me most Sunday afternoons, and had told me carefully, the way adult kids tell you things they're not sure you want to hear, that she'd been worried about her mother for close to a year. I'd heard her. I'd been watching the same thing she had. Our son, Kevin, was 28, worked as an electrician, lived 40 minutes away, and had spent the last year in the impossible position of a kid caught between 2 parents whose marriage was quietly falling apart around him. I never asked him to pick a side. He didn't deserve that, and whatever came next, that part wasn't going to change. The first thing I noticed was the phone. I want to be clear, I'm not a man who goes digging through his wife's phone. That's not who I am, and it never was. But you notice behavior, even when you're not looking for it. Nancy had always left her phone anywhere, face up on the counter, on the arm of the couch, not a thought given to it. Starting sometime around the previous spring, the phone started going with her. into the bathroom, out to the car for calls she used to just take standing in the kitchen. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I just kept watching, the way you watch a piece of machinery that's starting to make a sound it didn't used to make. The second thing was the trips. Nancy had a college roommate, Deborah, who'd moved to Sarasota years back, and Nancy visited her twice a year, like clockwork, every February and every October, same as she had for a decade. Starting about 18 months before all this, she started going 3 times a year, then 4. One of those trips, in the fall, stretched to 11 days, which she explained as needing the extra time because Deborah's husband had just had surgery. I didn't push on it. I didn't have anything solid enough yet to push on. But I noted the frequency, and I noted the way she came back from each trip, a little more settled somewhere else in her own head, the way a person gets when they've got somewhere better waiting for them than the place they're currently standing. The third thing was the question about the business. On an ordinary Sunday evening, during what started as a conversation about refinancing the mortgage, Nancy asked me, out of nowhere, what I thought Ferris Cold Chain was actually worth these days. Not in a general way. In a specific way, comparable sales in the industry, whether I'd had a formal valuation done recently, what a fair number would look like on paper. I answered her honestly, because at that point I had no reason not to, but I noted the questions. I noted that she'd asked them with the kind of precision that told me she'd been sitting with those questions a lot longer than that one conversation. I called Curtis Ferris the following week. Curtis was 61 by then, retired, still sharp, and he'd known Nancy and me since before we were Nancy and me. I told him what she'd asked. I didn't tell him what I thought it meant. I asked him what he thought it meant. He was quiet on the line for a second. Then he said, "Walter, that's not a casual question. That's the question you ask when you're trying to figure out what a marital asset is worth in a divorce." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you telling me you think Nancy's planning to leave?" I said, "I'm telling you I'm watching something, and I want another set of eyes on it." He said, "What do you need from me?" I said, "I'll let you know." I drove home from the warehouse that night and sat in my truck in the driveway for close to 15 minutes before I went inside. I sat there with everything I'd been quietly collecting: the phone, the trips, the valuation question, plus one more thing I hadn't told Curtis, because I hadn't told anybody yet. About a year before all this, I'd sat down at the shared computer in the den to pay a bill, and Nancy's email was already open on the screen, and a subject line was sitting right there in the inbox where I couldn't help but see it. "Can't wait for October, same place as last year?" The sender's name was Gregory Halstead. I didn't open it. I noted the name, closed the browser, and paid the bill I'd sat down to pay. I am not a man who makes decisions off half of something. A name I didn't know, a message I hadn't read, that was not enough to build anything on. But I spent 2 nights after that doing the kind of research the internet lets anybody do if they're patient about it. Gregory Halstead, Sarasota, Florida, 60 years old, worked in commercial real estate, graduated from the same high school Nancy had, 3 years ahead of her. There was a class reunion page, public, unlocked, with photos going back a decade, and in one of them, a reunion from 6 years back. Nancy and Gregory Halstead were standing next to each other, with their arms around each other's shoulders, in the easy, a familiar way people stand when a reunion isn't really the reason they're glad to see each other. 6 years before I came home to an empty house, whatever this was had already started at a high school reunion in Bucks County. I sat with that for a long time. Then I picked up the phone and called a family law attorney a colleague had recommended, a woman named Patricia Ruiz, whose office was in Doylestown, 20 minutes from the house. I called her and asked her one question. If I believe my wife is planning to leave this marriage and make a claim on my business as part of it, what do I need to do, starting now? She said, "Come in Thursday morning. Bring every business document you have." I brought everything. What Patricia told me across 2 meetings, that August was the kind of information that changes how you see the ground you're standing on. She was in her early 50s, direct, and she told me what was true instead of what I wanted to hear, which is the only kind of lawyer worth paying for. She said, "Pennsylvania is an equitable distribution state. The court divides marital property fairly, which doesn't mean equally, and depending on how your business is structured and when the growth actually happened, it can absolutely be treated as a marital asset." She said, "The question that matters is what you can document. what existed before the marriage, what happened during it, and what you can prove. I told her I'd started the business 7 years into the marriage. She said, then the growth of that business during your marriage is very likely to be considered marital property unless you can show otherwise with real documentation. She leaned forward. Walter, I want to be straight with you. If your wife is asking valuation questions and traveling to see someone in Florida, and you genuinely believe she's preparing to leave, the timing of what you do next matters more than almost anything else in this conversation. I asked her what my options were. She said the most important protection, a prenuptial agreement, didn't exist for us, so that door was already closed. The next best thing was proper documentation, establishing, cleanly and provably, what belonged to me before the marriage, and what portion of the business's growth could be attributed to factors outside the marriage itself. She said, I'm not telling you to hide anything. I'm telling you to document the truth of what you already own, because right now, none of that is written down anywhere that would hold up if this became contested. I spent the next several months working with my accountant, a careful, no-nonsense woman named Ruth Okonkwo, who'd handled Ferris Cold Chain's books since 2007. Together, we built out the documentation Patricia needed premarital contributions, the portion of company growth tied to Curtis's original investment and my own work before the marriage even started, records that told the actual story, instead of leaving room for somebody else to invent one. Patricia reviewed it that winter and told me it was some of the cleanest asset documentation she'd seen from a business our size in over a decade of practice. Then she asked me something else. Have you thought about protecting anything beyond the business? I told her to go on. She said the house. If I genuinely believed a departure was coming, and I had the equity position and the paperwork to support it, there were legitimate ways to establish what portion of the home's value was mine individually. I told her the house was in both our names. She said that could still be addressed, not by taking Nancy off the deed, which she said flatly she would never advise and which would look terrible besides, but by documenting the down payment source, the mortgage history, what I'd personally put into it before and during the marriage. Then she paused and said, and Walter, the retirement account, the joint one, the one sitting around $260,000 right now. I asked what about it. She said, how's it titled? I told her, joint, both names, right of survivorship. She said, either one of you can move money out of that account without the other's permission. I said I believed that was true. She said, I'm not telling you to move it preemptively without cause. I'm telling you that in situations like this, sometimes the person who sees it coming moves first, and I want you to understand that reality before it becomes a problem instead of an option. I sat with that for a long while. 19 years of work sat inside that account. It was not a number I was prepared to just watch vanish one afternoon. I didn't move it. I wasn't going to do anything that could later be twisted into looking like I'd acted improperly first. But I did open a separate individual account at a different bank, and starting that spring, I began redirecting my personal salary from Ferris Cold Chain into that account instead of into anything joint. It was legal. It was documented. It was exactly the kind of thing a person is entitled to do with money they've personally earned, and Patricia confirmed every step of it in writing. By the time I came home to the empty house, that individual account held $71,000. I'd moved there over 11 months. The joint retirement account had held $290,000, the amount Nancy had apparently been watching just as closely as I had, and had moved, 4 days before I got home from Denver, to Gregory Halstead's bank in Sarasota. 4 years in the making, or longer a life she'd been quietly constructing while I was flying to conventions and coming home on Tuesdays to a house that looked, from the outside, exactly like a marriage. I read her letter a second time after I'd read the account statement. 3 pages, her handwriting careful and even, clearly rewritten more than once before she'd let herself commit to a final draft. She wrote that she'd been unhappy longer than I probably realized, that she'd tried different ways of fixing it and none of them had worked, that she'd found someone who understood parts of her I hadn't, in her words, made room for. In a long time, she wasn't asking for forgiveness because she said she knew she hadn't earned it. She said our attorneys would handle the money and she hoped we could keep it civil. She said she was sorry. She said it twice. She said she hoped I'd be all right. I put the letter down. I looked at the account statement again. $290,000, 4 days ago, to Florida, while I was standing in a convention hall, talking about compressor units. I picked up my phone and called Patricia Ruiz. It was 5:45 on a Tuesday evening. She answered on the second ring, which is what happens when you've been a client for the better part of a year and your lawyer has known this call was coming for a while now. She said, "Walter." I said, "She left today. The house is stripped. She moved 290,000 out of the retirement account 4 days ago." A short silence. Then she said, "Are you at the house right now?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Don't touch anything else. Don't throw anything out. I need photos of every empty room and that account statement in the next 20 minutes. Can you do that?" I told her I was already doing it. She said, "Good. I'm filing an emergency motion tonight to freeze the Sarasota account. There's no guarantee we recover all of it, but this puts it on the record immediately. Walter, listen to me. Everything we've built over the last 11 months has been getting ready for exactly this moment. The business documentation, the premarital equity records, the salary redirection paper trail. We're ready." I said, "I know." She asked how I was doing. I told her, "I'm clear. That's the only thing I've got room for right now." She said, "That's enough. I'll have the motion filed by 9. Call me in the morning." I spent the next hour photographing every empty room. The bare walls with their scattered nail holes. The kitchen with the open cabinets. The bedroom where the mattress was gone, but my closet sat untouched. My shirts hanging in the same order, which told me again that this had been done carefully, in pieces, over time, not in a single, furious afternoon. A house doesn't empty out like that all at once. It empties the way water leaves a tank through a slow valve instead of a burst pipe. You don't see it happening until the level's already dangerously low. I called Melissa from the bare living room. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what I'd walked into. She went quiet, and then, very steady, she said, "Dad, how long have you known?" I told her I'd started watching almost a year earlier, that I'd been working with a lawyer since that August. She asked if I'd known about Gregory Halstead. I told her, since the spring before that. Another silence. Then, "You never said anything," I said. There was nothing worth saying until I had something worth doing. I needed to be ready before it happened, not scrambling after. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was functional. She said, "I'm getting in the car." I told her it was 2 hours from where she lived. She said, "I'll be there by 9. Is there any food in the house?" I looked at the gutted kitchen. I told her there was not currently any food in the house. She said, "I'll bring something. Don't go to sleep before I get there." She drove the 2 hours with a bag of groceries from a supermarket near the turnpike and a casserole dish her neighbor had pressed on her on the way out the door, which was somehow both the most practical and the most tender thing I'd encountered all day, and I didn't fully feel the weight of it until much later. We walked through the empty rooms together, not saying a lot, her just being present the way her mother used to be present in hard moments, before her mother had apparently decided to stop being present at all. Standing in the bare living room, Melissa said, "It's just stuff, Dad." I told her I knew that. She said, "You built all of this once. You can build it again." I told her I knew that too. She asked what the lawyer had said about the money. I told her the emergency motion had been filed, that the Sarasota account was flagged, that recovery was going to be complicated, but the documentation gave us the strongest position possible. She asked about the business. I told her the business was mine, that Ruth and Patricia had built a record that made that about as solid as it could be. Melissa looked at me the way a daughter looks at her father when she's trying to figure out if what he's saying lines up with what he's actually carrying. She has her mother's eyes and, I've come to think, my own stubbornness about not showing what something costs you. She said, "Dad, I know you go into logistics mode when things get bad. I also know you were married to this woman for 26 years, and you came home to an empty house today. You're allowed to not be okay." I told her I knew I was allowed. I said I was choosing clarity right now because it was useful, and that whatever else I was going to feel would still be there once the useful part was finished. She said, "That's very you." I asked if that was a criticism. She said no, an observation. She said, Mom used to say you were the most prepared man she'd ever met. I told her, your mother was smarter than the two of us combined. She probably would have handled this better than I'm handling it. Melissa said, you're handling it fine, Dad. I told her I knew. We sat on the bare floor because there was nowhere else to sit, and we ate her neighbor's casserole out of the dish with 2 forks, and we talked past midnight about things that mattered and plenty that didn't, and somewhere in there the empty house stopped being the scene of the worst afternoon of my adult life, and just became a house that needed furniture, which, compared to everything else, is a solvable problem. The divorce took 10 months. Patricia Ruiz was every bit as thorough as her reputation had promised. Everything Ruth and I had built over those 11 months turned out to be the foundation for the whole proceeding: the business valuation, the premarital equity analysis, the salary redirection with a complete paper trail behind every dollar, and the full timeline of the retirement account transfer to Gregory Halstead's bank in Sarasota. Nancy had hired an attorney down in Florida, a man named Preston Cade, competent enough, but walking into a situation our preparation had already narrowed down to almost nothing. The retirement account transfer became, exactly as Patricia had predicted, the center of the entire case. The money had moved 4 days before she filed. The receiving account belonged to Gregory Halstead. The 6 years of history, the reunion photo, the email I'd seen the year before, the escalating trips to Sarasota, all of it built a timeline that Preston Cade simply couldn't talk his way around. The court found that moving $290,000 out of a joint account 4 days before filing counted as dissipation of marital assets. The funds were ordered back into the estate for proper division. Nancy received a portion because Pennsylvania law entitled her to it regardless of the circumstances. I received the rest. It wasn't a perfect outcome. Nothing about any of this was, but it was a far better outcome than it would have been if that transfer had gone unchallenged, or if I hadn't spent 11 months building the record that made challenging it possible. The business was reviewed by a court-appointed evaluator who confirmed everything Ruth had documented. The portion of Ferris Cold Chain's value tied to the marriage years went into the marital estate. The portion tied to premarital work and Curtis's original stake did not. It was a painful number. Either way, there's no version of dividing something you spent 19 years building that doesn't sting, but it was accurate, and it was defensible, and it was built on a true record instead of somebody's convenient version of one. There was one moment in all of it that I still think about, more than any of the paperwork or the motions or the legal maneuvering. During a deposition that spring, in Patricia's conference room, Preston Cade asked me about the individual account I'd opened, wanting to know why I'd started redirecting my salary away from our joint accounts 11 months before Nancy ever filed. I told him I'd had reason to believe, based on what I'd observed, that a divorce was likely, and that I'd taken legal steps to protect what I was individually earning from that point forward. He asked when exactly I'd first come to that belief. I told him, the spring before last. He asked what specifically had led me there. I told him several things: the change in her phone habits, the increasing trips to Florida, the questions about the business's value, and a name I'd seen in an email a year before any of it became obvious: Gregory Halstead. The room went quiet. Nancy was sitting across the table, the first time I'd been in the same room with her since the day I came home to nothing. I hadn't looked directly at her the entire deposition. I looked at her then. She was staring at the table in front of her. Preston Cade said he had no further questions on that subject. I glanced at Patricia. Her face didn't change at all, because she didn't need it to. What had just happened in that room was the entire point of the previous 11 months, not the paperwork, not the motions, but the exact moment Nancy understood that while she'd been quietly planning her exit, I had been quietly planning right alongside her, starting at almost the same time she had. She thought she'd been the only one managing this situation. She'd actually been inside one I had already mapped out, months before she ever packed a single box. The settlement was finalized that winter. We sold the house on Whitfield Court. I split the equity the way the court ordered and bought a smaller place outside Doylestown, a stone farmhouse from the 1930s with a detached garage. I've slowly been turning into a wood shop and a half-acre of yard that needed more work than I expected but has been good for me to put my hands into. Melissa comes by most weekends. Kevin shows up for dinner when his schedule lets him, which is more often than I expected once the dust settled. Curtis Ferris drove out on a Saturday that fall and spent the whole day helping me put up shelving in the garage, which is the kind of thing a man who's known you for 2 decades does, without you having to ask, because he already knows when you need it. I've thought a lot about something Melissa said, standing in that bare living room with a casserole dish in her hands. She said, "It's just stuff." She was right. The furniture, the photographs off the hallway wall, the rug from Santa Fe, all of it was replaceable. What mattered the business I'd spent 19 years building, the documentation that protected it, the equity in the house, the relationship with my kids, all of that stayed intact. Not because I got lucky, because I'd spent 11 months making sure it would. I should tell you something I haven't told you yet, because it's the piece of my history that explains why I move through hard things the way I do. My first wife, Diane, Melissa, and Kevin's mother died in a highway accident in the spring of 2009 when Melissa was 14. I met Nancy almost 2 years after that, and I'll admit now that some part of what drew me to her was how little she resembled anything about what I'd lost. When you lose somebody without a single second of warning, when there's no version of preparing for it, you learn something at the bottom of yourself about how much damage the things you never saw coming can do. What you can control, after that, you prepare for completely, without exception, without assuming anybody's intentions are good, just because they've always been good before. Because the things you don't prepare for are the things that leave you standing in a stripped bare kitchen, holding an account statement with no leverage and no record and nowhere to turn. I had a record. I had 11 months of it. My own father used to tell me, "Walter, the difference between a man who goes down and stays down and a man who goes down and gets back up isn't strength. It's whether he saw the punch coming. A man who sees it coming has already decided what he's doing next before he even hits the ground. I saw this one coming. I decided what I was going to do about it 11 months before it landed. And on a Tuesday evening in March, standing in an empty kitchen holding an envelope that was supposed to tell me my life was over, what I actually found inside it was proof that the work I'd already quietly done was enough. That's the only kind of document that ever really matters, in the end. Not the one that tells you what somebody else did to you, the one that proves what you built before they had the chance to take it. The garage workshop is coming along. The yard's in better shape than when I bought the place. The shelves Curtis and I put up are full of tools I brought over from Whitfield Court, tools that were always mine and that nobody had any claim to, because they'd been sitting in the garage the whole time, and the garage was never part of what got emptied out that March. Some Sunday mornings I make coffee, carry it out to the shop, and just stand there in the smell of sawdust for a while, thinking about whatever's next. There's always something next, when you're a man who's spent his whole life thinking 3 steps ahead. Right now, it's a set of kitchen cabinets I've been sketching out for a few weeks. Good joints, solid dimensions, built to actually last. That's what you do afterward, family. You build something that holds. If this one stayed with you, tell me down in the comments which moment hit you hardest. Hit that like button for me, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I'll see you in the next one. Claude responded, "Being ready doesn't mean expecting the worst from people you love. It means loving them with your eyes open, so that whatever happens, you're never left with." Being ready doesn't mean expecting the worst from people you love. It means loving them with your eyes open, so that whatever happens, you're never left with nothing. Walter didn't lose his family, his work, or his footing because he paid attention long before he needed to. That's the quiet gift of preparation. It doesn't make heartbreak disappear, but it makes sure you can still stand, rebuild, and open your door to the people who stayed. A small note for you. This story was imagined and written by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope its gentle life lesson still finds a place in your heart.